Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 7, Halacha 3, in the Art Scroll 67a2. We're going to talk now about another case where you need to tithe someone else's produce, but there has to be a stipulation. This, again, is talking about Demai. So over here, we're talking about a laborer who's getting fed by his employer, and he does not trust the employer regarding the food. So the Mishnah reads, a laborer who is fed by his employer but does not trust that the employer is separating out the tithes before serving him the food, he's going to do as follows. Now, this Mishnah does not necessarily refer to a case where the employer is an Am Ha'aretz. It actually is talking about a laborer who does not trust. That means that for some reason he does not trust this person to be separating tithes at all. And there are a couple of cases, right? You have one case where you have someone who's Am Ha'aretz who's going to separate out most of the tithes, but maybe not Trumas Meiser or Truma Gedola. You have another case where maybe they will separate out Truma Gedola, but not the other tithes. You have another case that Am Ha'aretz will separate out all the tithes except for the Meiser Sheni. And then you have another Am Ha'aretz will separate out everything. And then you have this other case of people who just don't separate out the tithes. They're not trusted on it. The Mishnah is going to refer even to an employer who is a haver, but who invited the laborer to eat in his home. And in this situation, the employer is allowed to serve a poor worker Demai, just as one is allowed to serve any poor person Demai, provided he informs him of the status ahead of time. Now, the poor person is allowed to eat the Demai as it is, but if he wants to be stringent, he can tithe it first. And if he's going to tithe it, here's how he's going to do it. So when it's talking about a laborer who does not trust the employer, yeah, it can mean somebody who's an Am Ha'aretz. It can also mean somebody who's not trusted in tithing at all. And it also can mean a haver who is inviting a poor worker to come to the house to come and eat the food, eat the mai, and the poor worker is religious and he wants to separate out the tithes anyway. So that, and by the way, that is totally fine. You're allowed to feed a poor worker without separating out the tithes. That is a rabbinic leniency. And okay, the guy is poor, but he wants to come separate the tithes anyway. So the haver in that case is not doing anything wrong. The poor person is just being stringent. So this is going to be the case where he wants to go and make the tithes. And the Mishnah says that assuming he will be served 100 dried figs, so that's the basis of what we're dealing with. And then for any other food, you're going to go and you're going to calculate it out for some other food. Now, this Mishnah is talking about a worker who's negotiating with the employer that he's going to get a daily ration of 100 dried figs. And this number is just picked by the Mishnah because it's easy to calculate and it's easy to see the ratios. So it says that he takes one dried fig and says, this dried fig and the next 9 figs that I will come after it are hereby made into Meiser Rishon. For the 90 I will eventually eat. And this first dried fig is hereby made into Truma Meiser for the 10 of Meiser Rishon. And the Meiser Sheni is hereby designated in the last figs. In other words, the last 10% I will eventually take. And the Meiser Sheni is hereby deconsecrated on the coins set aside for the purpose. And then he can go and eat the figs. So the designation here goes into effect retroactively. This is going to be a case of, yes, you're saying that there is Breira. And this is going to be retroactive after the worker finishes eating all of the 99 figs. And then when the figs he rectified are going to get identified, then it's going to go into effect. So he can eat each fig as he takes it, relying on this retroactive designation, says Rabbi Kanievsky, that they will go into effect once the figs are eaten. And this permit, again, is based on the principle of Breira. Now, we were dealing with cases of when things are not Breira. Now, how would we do it like in the first 2 halachot of chapter 7 if we didn't hold that there was Breira? Let's say you already have figs in your possession that you have right now. You start the process, and then all you're going to do is when you're given the final set of figs, you're going to identify it and say, oh, these figs here in this northern part, this is going to be the tithe. But over here, this is where he's getting all of the figs at once, and now he's doing the separations as he's eating them. And these retroactive designations go into effect once the figs are eaten. And that is going to be the difference with Breira. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that he may not deduct, before that it says, but he may deduct his ration of the one dried fig that he designated as Trumas Meiser and eat only 99 of the employer's figs. So there's this one fig that you're designating to start, and he can't just take an additional fig to complete this ration of 100 figs because, yes, the employer agrees to feed him 100 figs, but the laborer ends up sustaining a loss because of the separation of Trumas Meiser. Remember, when you're separating out tithes, the portion that you have available after tithes gets smaller and smaller. So if he says, okay, I'm going to give you 100 figs, well, when you start separating out the tithes, you get less than 100 figs. And in this case, what about this first fig in here, which will be the first one that you're starting with? So in the cases of the last Mishnahs, the guest may eat or drink as much as he wants. He doesn't have to refrain from eating the amount corresponding to the Trumas Meiser he designates, and that's going to be because the host wants the guest to enjoy himself. But over here, we're talking about a laborer, and Rabbi Kanievsky says that taking the additional fig from the employer is going to constitute stealing. So again, he's given a wage of 100 figs as like a food stipend, and now you have to separate out the tithes, and now you're going to have less than 100. So where do you make it up from? If you take it from the extra one from the employer, well, then it could be stealing. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that he may not deduct from his daily ration because by doing so he diminishes the efficiency of his work for the employer. In other words, he has to go out, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and purchase an additional dried fig to eat in its place for the one that he designates as Trumas Meiser. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to agree with the Tana Kama that the employer is not allowed to, it was not obligated to provide the laborer with this additional fig to make up for this Truma Meiser, and he's going to argue that the laborer may not simply abstain from eating the 100th fig, rather he must purchase an additional dried fig, separate its tithes, so that he will end up eating the full complement of 100 figs that's rationed, that he agreed upon with the employer. So eating even one fig less threatens to diminish the quality of his work. In other words, what's going on here, the laborer says, look, I know that if you eat 100 figs, you're going to work better for me. So if you're going to eat fewer than 90 figs or 100 figs, your work isn't going to be as good, and you're going to diminish the work quality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 100. The question comes, okay, now I have to separate out tithes. Maybe you can't trust the employer for separating out the tithes properly. And what do you do when you separate out the Meiser Rishon? So over here, you're worried, for the Trumas Meiser. So you're worried over here that if you're eating under the 100 figs, you're going to end up stealing from the employer by not doing your full amount of work because you don't have enough energy to do it. And on the other hand, where do you get this extra fig from? You got to make up the fig to get to 100 to get this ration, okay? So you can't eat less than 100. You got to eat the amount that's allotted to you because that's the deal between you and the employer so that you have the energy and the strength to do the work that he needs. And you can't diminish how much efficiency that you have for the employer. And so where do you get it? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that you go out, you buy it on your own expense in advance so that you can go and tithe this. The Mishnah says that Rabbi Yossi says he need not deduct from his ration of the employer's figs. Rather, although he designated one fig as Trumas Meiser, he may still eat 100 figs of the employer's figs. And that's going to be because of a stipulation of the court. So basically, Rabbi Yossi says that the court realized that there's a problem here, And he's going to say that, look, you can't take somebody else's property without a bet din ruling. And the bet din ruled that in this case, that they're going to take the one fig from the employer so that he actually is eating 100 to make up this food ration so he has the energy to do the work. And it's going to be the employer who has to compensate the laborer for this trumas meiser that he's going to separate from the ration. And basically what Rabbi Yossi is saying is that the bet din enacted that the employer sustains the loss of the fig that gets designated as trumas meiser. And in order to fill his commitment to provide the laborer with 100 figs, he has to give him an extra fig. That was the rationale for the bet din's ruling. This, by the way, is the explanation of the Rosh. The Rosh. The Rambam has a different understanding for this. Anyway, the Mishnah is going to talk about the case of a worker who does not trust that his employer is tithing the ration properly. Or again, it could even be a poor worker that goes to the house of a haver, and in that case, he doesn't need to separate tithes for Demai he's giving them, but the poor person wants to separate the tithes anyway. And over here, the Mishnah's ruling applies even to this haver, and accordingly, the Mishnah's expression that the laborer does not trust seems imprecise. And the Gemara is going to get into that. The Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar says in the name of Rabbi Hoshaya, the Mishnah means that they treated the laborer in our Mishnah's case as if he is employed by an Am Haaretz and does not trust the employer regarding tithes. So over here, says the Marafulda, just as one who is employed by an Am Haaretz must separate the tithes from his ration and abstain from eating the amount he separated as trumas meiser, so too, when a poor laborer is employed by a haver who serves him demai and he separates the tithes for his meal, he must abstain from eating the amount he separates as trumas meiser. So in the Mishnah's case, the laborer now designates one dried fig as trumas meiser for other figs that he's going to come to eat. And the Gemara is going to clarify what is the law if these figs are destroyed before he has a chance to eat them, or the truma meiser is destroyed before he eats the figs. Now, again, this is going to be all dealt with Breira, right? So if you're making these designations beforehand, and then it's based upon you eating them to fulfill it, and for some reason this gets destroyed, it becomes like you ate Tevel because these tithes didn't come into existence yet. You didn't fulfill the stipulation that you made, and that's going to be what the issue is. So that's what we're dealing with, because you might end up eating Tevel if it disappears and the object for which you're doing Breira on is no longer there. It didn't work, and you might end up actually doing Breira in the opposite direction, where what you ate wasn't tithed at all and was actually just Tevel retroactively. Very, very serious. So the Gemara continues, says the following matter is obvious. It says, if the rest of the produce was burned or destroyed before the laborer has the chance to eat it, then the truma meiser designation is nullified, and the designated fig is again going to be in the original state of Tevel, since the stipulation on what you made it into truma was never fulfilled. So basically, where this person is going and making the stipulation in the Mishnah, Rabbi Kanievsky says like this. He says that the laborer specified that the first fig should be trumas meiser, and saying that the 99 that I will eat. And so since he never ate those 99, those stipulations were never fulfilled, and the truma meiser doesn't rectify anything because it left existence, and it was all based on something being retroactive, and it never happened. So in this case, the designation is going to be nullified, and the fig that was meant to be truma meiser goes back to the state of Tevel. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say the following matter, however, is not obvious, that if the truma or the truma meiser was burned or otherwise destroyed before the laborer had a chance to eat, the procedure that comes to rectify it, what's the law? In other words, does the original truma designation remain valid and allow him to eat the remaining produce on its basis, or does he have to designate another fig as truma meiser before eating the remaining produce? So where he's coming to say, since the truma meiser, was based on the stipulation that's going to go rectify the figs that I will eat. In other words, that's what he's saying in the Mishnah, that I will eat, perhaps it must still be in existence when he fulfills this stipulation. And if it exists at that time, then the designation is retroactively effective. But if it does not exist at the time, then maybe the designation cannot take effect. So that's going to be the question here. Is there Breira or not? And if there is Breira, then if this thing is leaving the world, then maybe that stipulation didn't actually mean anything. So the Gemara is going to sum this up. It's going to say, whenever the remaining produce is eaten by the laborer, the truma or the truma meiser becomes sanctified retroactively, and therefore the designation is valid, even if the truma portion no longer exists at that time. So what we see here, says Rabbi Kanievsky, is that since the truma meiser designation takes effect retroactively, there's no need for the truma meiser to exist when the produce that it rectifies is identified. So the fact that it exists initially at the time it was designated as trumas meiser is going to be enough. And once the produce it rectifies is identified, it is considered as having been truma meiser from the first moment. So because he can identify it when it first comes into existence, that's going to be enough. There's some other approaches on this, but the Mishnah stated that according to the Tanna Kama, the laborer must deduct one dried fig, and the Gemara is going to clarify what this means. And it's going to say, what is the meaning of the laborer deducts one fig? And the Gemara says it means that from his own food ration of 100 dried figs, he takes out one dried fig to designate as truma meiser, and then he's left with 99 figs to eat. So again, we're dealing with a case where he's getting a food ration. He's getting a food ration of 100 figs to make sure he has the energy to eat it. And he has to separate out the ties. Where does this extra fig come from in order to get to 100, but also to have the ties taken out? So over here, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel ruled that the laborer may not deduct anything from the daily ration, and that's going to diminish the efficiency of the work. So where do you get this fig from? You got to go get it, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, you got to go get it from an outside source so that you can come up to 100. So it was taught in a Breira that one may not plow with his cow by night and then rent it out by day. Now, why is that going to be? This is going to be where your cow gets tired out from working at night, and then you can't have a fully effective, productive cow in the daytime. And Mara Fulda's holding that the cow will be tired from working the entire night. And this implies that if the owner plows with the cow for only part of the night and let it rest until the morning, he's going to be allowed. He's going to be allowed to rent it the next day. And the idea is that if you're diminishing the effectiveness of the cow on the next day, you have a problem when you're renting it out. And if you're doing something that's not diminishing the effectiveness of the cow, then it's going to be okay. And so we're getting into the same sort of situation here. You're giving a food ration to have a certain amount of effectiveness. And if you're diminishing that, you're forbidden to do it. So the Gemara says, similarly, one may not do work within his own property by night and then hire himself out to others by day. And when hired, one may not starve himself nor afflict himself, because by doing so, he diminishes his work efficiency for the employer. So, for example, if you undereat or you overeat or you stay up late at night, even without working, and you don't rest properly, you're diminishing the efficiency, and that's going to constitute theft. And a worker is required to apply himself fully to the job for which he's hired. And that's what we see when Yaakov declares about himself that with all my might I served your father Lavan. This, by the way, is in Bereshit 31:26. So you have to be very careful about stealing in Judaism, and that's why even we're in this case dealing with this one fig. Where do we get this fig from? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says you have to make it up from your own wages, from your own savings, from what you have, and you can't just take it from the employer, because that too would be stealing. So there's another incident that gets related, that Rabbi Yochanan went to a certain place and found that the school teacher was very weak, And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "Why is this so?" And they replied, "Because he fasts frequently." And Rabbi Yochanan said to the teacher, "It is forbidden for you to fast." And it continues, says, "For if even regarding one who performs the work of flesh and blood employer, it was stated that he is forbidden to abstain from food, then regarding one who performs the work of the Holy One, and that's going to be the task of teaching Torah to children, is this surely not so?" In other words, since fasting diminishes your effectiveness at teaching, you're not allowed to fast. And the idea here is that in the case of a Torah teacher, there are actually two things. Okay, fasting is going to diminish the work of heaven, but it's also going to steal from the people who hired him and paid him a wage. And the rule here is not limited to Torah teachers. It's also going to be anybody who's working for the sake of heaven on some level. And this is going to be where you're going to be depriving yourself and lowering your effectiveness. So the Mishnah stated that Rabbi Yossi says that the laborer need not deduct a fig from his ration because it is a stipulation of the court that the employer must compensate the laborer for the truma meiser that he separates for the ration. In other words, this quotation of the Mishnah is from the Rosh Hashanah text, and most people are going to be agreeing that this is the meaning of how it's to be read. And the Gemara is going to elaborate. Rabbi Chia Bar Ashi says in the name of Rav that he taught in the following brisa, it is a stipulation of the court that truma meiser should be deducted from the stock of the employer and the meiser sheni from the stock of the laborer. So what we see here from the Rambam is going to be that after the laborer designates the proper amount of the employer's produce as meiser sheni, he must deconsecrate it onto his own deconsecrated coins. And the Bet Din, though, did not obligate the employer to compensate him for the meiser sheni deconsecration. Presumably that's going to be because the laborer does not have a monetary loss, since this deconsecrated money remains his, with the only restriction that he has to go and bring it to Jerusalem and eat it. And since the separating and deconsecrating of the meiser sheni does not diminish his ration at all, he may eat the meiser sheni portion immediately after he deconsecrates it. So because the meiser sheni doesn't represent the loss to this 100 figs, he can do that, because again, he's putting it on the coins, he retains the coins, and then he has to go eat the coins in the future, turn the coins into these Demai meiser sheni coins into money and eat the produce in Jerusalem, in the walls in Jerusalem. But over here, there's no loss. And again, how do we have this? Well, we have a taking here. And because there's a taking, basically, what the Rambam says is that Rabbi Yossi agrees with the Tanna Kama, and even the Tanna Kama holds that the employer sustains the loss of the Truma Meiser. And that's going to be the main point. But the question is, can the Tanna Kama actually mean that the laborer deducts the fig from his ration? And that's also going to be a question. So Rabbi Yochanan is basically having a case where it's a stipulation of the court that the Truma Meiser be deducted from the stock of the employer. And when the Tanna Kama states that one deducts the fig, he does not mean that he deducts it from his own ration. Rather, he deducts it from the employer's stock. And basically, Rabbi Yossi is holding that the burden of the Truma Meiser is going to be borne by the court, and it's going to be that basically a court stipulation in order how to get the property away from the employer so that the worker can make up this one missing fig so that he can get the stipulation in order to do the work. So in this Mishnah, we're talking about stipulation for tithing produce from an employer, and now in Halacha 4, we're going to be dealing with the stipulation for tithing wine that somebody gets from a Kuthian that's going to be Tevel. So that's coming up next. Have a great day.